Hi. I went and saw the movie Disclosure Day yesterday. Um, Mixed feelings about it. Um, Enjoyed it. Enjoyed the entertainment of it. Uh, there's a lot happening in the States at the moment about disclosure, with the UFO files being released slowly. It's a real drip feed for those of us who have been interested in these phenomenon for a long time. Um, I'd say, with regards to Steven Spielberg's movie, that it is a small snapshot of what is happening, but I think it's quite a necessary movie in the sense that I think it's part of the drip feed and part of getting this more into the cultural milieu, the cultural awareness um, that this is much bigger than just a sort of crazy person's fantasy. Because we don't really, I mean, a lot of the conversation around UFOs is kind of almost laughed off or seen as uh, fringe, I suppose. Whereas perhaps it's time we started thinking about them on a level that is more mainstream. Um, so, yeah, in terms of the narrative, what I did like is that it didn't present the aliens as being evil, because I think a lot of movies in the past have. Um, it's not necessarily to say that there could be evil ones out there, but that um, I think there is a notion, and I think there's a lot of different views about extraterrestrials, so many. And this is why I think it's important to start having a conversation around them, because there's those people who think, um, they're all demons. There's others who might think they're angels, even, or a mixture of both. Or um, there's the greys, which are the ones that are presented in the movie. And that's one of the things that I have, a bit of difficulty with, in that they're the only extraterrestrial species that are sort of shown in the movie, um, where essentially there could be many, many, many more. And I've certainly, in my research, heard of many more, and even had dreams about them. So, to me, just limiting it to the greys is a very small snapshot of what potentially is out there. Um, there's talk of Nordics, which I believe are the same as the Pleiadians. There's talk of mantis beings. There's talk of um, Lyrans, which are sort of lion-like beings. Um, there's talk of Syrians, which I believe is where actually the Greys come from, or they might come from Orion, which is possibly in the Sirius constellation. Is it? I can't remember. No, I think Orion's different, but there's this Sirius constellation as well. There's Andromedans, which there's a movie called Begonia on Netflix, which introduces the Andromedans as a possibility, but it sort of has a very negative view about them. When I was young, we had a movie called, a TV series called Sirius Children of the Dog Star. And I've heard of dog beings as well. If you've listened to Corey Good, he talks about blue avians, and that's mentioned in the Law of One. He also talks about beings with sort of triangular shaped heads and things like this, other dimensional beings. There's people like Bashar who are channeling what he calls as Essassani beings, who are meant to be a parallel future reality of Earth where we went through an environmental catastrophe or something, and or there's a notion, I think, that the Greys, and I think maybe the Essassanis are a grey race, because there's meant to be also tall greys and short greys, and some of them are not necessarily so good, and some of them are, and then there's also the notion that they use actually they find it difficult in our atmosphere, so they send down sort of partly constructed beings that they infuse with a consciousness to navigate around our airspace, but they're not actually the real beings. If you listen to Stephen Greer, who's very interesting, he says, I think, that there's something like 59 different types, or 69 I think it is, types of extraterrestrial that they've recorded and know about. He says that we've actually had reverse technology from alien spaceships that crashed in as early as 1947, and that we've traded. There's also notions that we've traded technology with Greys, that Eisenhower met with the Grey beings and the Nordics supposedly, and the Nordics offered him a path to world peace, whereas the Greys offered him technology that he could use to dominate the rest of the world and put America further ahead. But so there's a lot. There's also what I was getting to with Stephen Greer is he suggests that a lot of the spaceships you actually see out there are actually reversed engineered and are actually human operated spaceships. There's also the notion that he claims that many of the abductions that have happened are actually done as part of a Project Bluebeam, which is to incite fear into humanity regarding UFOs and aliens, and that actually it's part of a secret operation that is actually run by the shadow government, and that actually they are trying to in the future, possibly in the near future, fake an alien invasion so that it unites the whole world against aliens. There's also people like David Icke who talk about lizard reptilians a lot and believe that they're evil, and that they're running the world, that some of the people in power are shape-shifting lizard reptilians like the Queen, and some of the politicians in America. There's also the notion that there are star seeds, people who have incarnated on different planets before coming here, and that are coming here to help humanity evolve because they've come from different star systems. There's also the notion of the Anunnaki, which are presented by the Sumerians, and a planet called Nibiru that is meant to have been on an elliptical orbit with Earth, and that they were kind of like gods, and that they interbred with humanity, or the Nephilim. There's the Nephilim and the Elohim, who are angels, kind of fallen angels that interbred with humanity and created human races. There's also the notion that extraterrestrials have been a part of manipulating our genetics. Cryon, who is someone that I listen to, talks about Lemuria being an ancient civilization that existed in the Pacific, and where Pleiadians interacted with humanity at that time. We were a different kind of being, but that essentially Pleiadians fused our chromosomes together. I think it's something like the second and third chromosome together, because all of the animals on the planet have only 24 chromosomes, whereas we only have 23. So he suggests that there's actually a 24th chromosome that we have, which is multi-dimensional, which is kind of like in our DNA, and that sort of is our soul in a sense, or part of our soul, or it's a multi-dimensional aspect of our DNA that creates a energy field all around us, and has properties that we can tap into that we aren't aware of yet, and that one day we'll have technology where we can shine it on the DNA and see into this multi-dimensional aspect of our DNA, but we just haven't got the technology to do that yet. And once we do, we will see it. But he also believes that most of our soul is across the veil, and that only a small percentage of our soul is actually here on Earth. So anyway, there's a lot of different theories about aliens, and what I'm saying, I guess, is that the Steven Spielberg movie is just a very small snapshot of one particular alien race, and it doesn't sort of go into the possibility of other ones, but it is a start to the conversation. What I did find interesting is one of the things that I sort of found a bit of a struggle to me was the lack of abilities of the CIA. At times it seemed a little bit cheesy, where this news reporter who'd obviously had an experience with aliens was able to manipulate these people by appearing as their relatives, and suddenly they were able to just simply walk out of this hangar with all these CIA agents or the secret agency that whose job it was to keep all the information suppressed, basically, and they were just able to avoid them by her pretending that she had this kind of technology that she was able to manipulate so that she could appear to these people as their parents or daughters or things like that. And in another person's hands in the movie, he was able to sort of it almost became sort of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where he was able to kind of get inside someone's body, or alternatively to appear in front of them and have a conversation with them from a distance, which was interesting. I saw a post on Facebook about a depiction of something on a Egyptian temple or something like that, or with the Sumerians, where they had a device that they were holding in their hand that gave them godlike powers, and they were suggesting that this device in the movie was the same kind of thing. So yeah, there were a few different avenues that they did pursue, but it was, to me, quite limited in terms of personally the race that they touched on, but also in terms of there were just some bits that seemed a little bit far-fetched in terms of how stupid the people that were, how incompetent and stupid the people that were chasing these two people down were. These people were obviously trying to release all the UFO files. But one thing I did like about it is, firstly, that Steven Spielberg portrayed the aliens as being good. And this is where consciousness comes in as part of the extraterrestrial conversation, and the notion that there are trillions of, I think something like 1.5 trillion galaxies or something like that, with each with 1 billion stars in them, with planets circling them, and even if 1% of those solar systems had habitable planets in them, there would still be something like trillions of, or billions of, possibly inhabitable planets. That the notion that there are as many stars in the sky as there are grains of sand on all the beaches in the world, or something like that. The notion that there is intelligent life out there beyond on this earth seems highly likely. I think it would be arrogant to assume that there's not. NASA has been looking at habitable planets and found several of them. There is also a notion that we are already in space, and there was a movie a while ago with some people believe that the Nazis had extraterrestrial contact and were dealing with extraterrestrials, and that they were down in Antarctica dealing with extraterrestrial technology. There's also a notion that there's extraterrestrial technology down in Antarctica buried under the ice, and there's also the notion of inner Earth civilizations that have been on our planet for longer than we have, potentially. So there's really a lot to grasp. One thing I did find is at the end of the movie, as it kind of went towards the notion of all these files finally being released, and that is what's happening in the US at the moment. Is there's a slow drip feed of some of these sightings that have been recorded on pilot cams and things like that. So, and some of the files around them, but it's just a drip feed at the moment. But this, in the movie, it sort of comes out all at once, and everybody's watching it at the same time, and that it was quite moving, that moment, when this sort of secrecy that's been hidden for so long, for those of us who have always known that there's something bigger out there than, and that, there's, that our lives, our mundane kind of lives of going to work each day and eating and sleeping and all of that, that there's something grander to the cosmos than just that. And that also brings in the notion of spirituality, and also with it religion. And it was interesting that in the movie, one of the women is a nun, and she is of the notion that God's creation includes extraterrestrials, and that it never said in the Bible that humanity was the only race that he created. That she suggested that excuse me, that the notion that there were always potentially more out there, and so that brings into it the notion that God is way bigger than we imagine him to be, or her, or it. That it brings in a wider conversation if you're to include a whole lot of beings on other planets, and that the universe is way bigger than we believe. And on that note, there are, if you delve into things like the secret space program, there are notions that we've already had human beings living in other on other planets, or living in space, or working in space, or being a part of this thing called a galactic federation. And that's another thing, is the notion that there was a planet in our solar system called Maldek where beings lived, and that planet is now the asteroid belt, and that's why Mars is the way it was, is because Mars was the moon of Maldek, and there were beings living on Mars and on Maldek, and Maldek got destroyed and in a war, there's the notion of that the lizard reptilians are destroying planets in various galaxies. There's a talk of a thing called the Lyran Wars, where the lizard reptilians destroyed the Lyran's home planet of Vega, and that the Lyrans were then forced to travel to other solar systems and settle on different planets. So there's a lot of information out there about all sorts of things regarding extraterrestrials that a lot of people, if they haven't delved into it, have only really scratched the surface. If you bring reincarnation into that, the notion is that these souls that were trapped on Maldek have reincarnated on Earth to go through, and on Mars from when it got destroyed, that they have incarnated on Earth to continue their evolutionary growth. There's also, I was told in a yoga class about the Incan cosmology, where they believed that the lizard reptilians were on this planet prior and were using our race, or it might be the Anunnaki, or that they're kind of, they talk about the Archons as well, where these races were here before us and used humanity to mine gold, which they could take back to their planet. So humanity was a kind of slave race that they used to mine gold, and then it's said that the Pleiadians came along and felt sorry for us and were at war with the reptilians, and they then seeded us with a soul so that we would evolve, and gave us that multi-dimensional aspect to our DNA, and that the lizard reptilians have a time limit on this planet, or the Anunnaki or the Archons or whatever have a time limit on this planet where they're only allowed to be here for a certain time, and then they have a contract which is running out and they have to leave, but they will try and take as many people with them to the dark side, kind of thing. That's part of the law of one also, is that there's service to self beings and service to other beings, that this planet is evolving into a fifth density planet, or a fourth density planet possibly, from being a third density planet, and in evolving, I think it's evolving from a third density to a fourth density planet, that's right. But there's also different dimensions as well. So there's third dimensional planet to a 5D, which Cryon actually says is the same as multi-dimensional. So it doesn't go from 3D to 5D, it goes from 3D to multi-dimensional. But density is something different. So in the law of one, they talk about how you're either service to self and service to others, and you have a kind of percentage of your being, of your consciousness, which is either service to self or service to others. And to be on a third density planet, it's something like between 5 and 50% service to others, whereas if you're on a fourth density negative planet, you then have to be less than 5% service to others. So you have to be completely service to self to go to a fourth density negative planet, but to go to a fourth density positive planet, you have to evolve to something like over between 50 and 70%, I think it is, or something like that. Can't remember the exact numbers, but you can read about it in a book called The Law of One, which are channelings from extraterrestrial races, and that the notion is that this planet is evolving into a fourth density positive planet, and so you have to have evolved beyond that level, and that if you don't get to that level, then you will reincarnate on another planet that is third density like Earth. But this opportunity only happens every so often, where the whole planet is actually evolving into a different density, where so you can either sort of rise in consciousness to be a part of this new density planet, this higher consciousness planet, or you'll have to reincarnate elsewhere. So that's another theory. One thing I do want to say about Disclosure Day is the grey at the end, which seemed a lot taller and a lot bigger, so I'm assuming it's one of the tall greys who are meant to be more benevolent beings. It had a very big head, and I had one time at a festival, I did a quantum hypnosis training, which was like basically a hypnosis where a regression, but it wasn't a regression, it was actually, this one was, we did one regression where you look back into past lives, but we also did, it's like what you do is you imagine yourself going through a door, and the door opens to a past life 100 years in the past, or 300 years in the past, or you're open to a life that is in the future. So I opened to a life 100 years in the future, and then we did one 300 years in the future. So in the one that I did where we went 100 years into the future, I had this vision of being on a planet living in these kind of biodomes, which reminded me of a property that I used to be on in America, which was built by John Denver, called the Biodome, which had a biodome on it. And the idea was that these communities were going to live in these biodomes, but they only ended up building one. But on this planet, that I had a vision of in the 100-year future vision door that I walked through, we were living in biodomes, humans living in biodomes, but there was one of these beings that looked exactly like the being that was in the Steven Spielberg movie. It was tall and taller than us, and had a massive head. And in the dream that I had, or the vision that I had, I believe that this being was treated on this planet as kind of royalty, or they were the kind of king or ruler of the planet, and we were their subjects almost, which was interesting in this vision that I had. And then in the other dream that I had, which was 300 years into the future, I became a blue avian being, which was similar to the ones that I've seen depicted in the Corey Good conversations, where I became one of these blue avian beings, and I was in this, I could travel by thinking. So if I wanted to be somewhere, I could vibrationally think of that place and move to that place through thought. So you moved by thought rather than walking there, but it was like I was flying through the ether and landing there through vibration somehow. And then while I was there, and these beings were actually beyond gender, they were kind of androgynous, had kind of both genders, and yet they were sort of more one than the other. And I had a kind of twin flame kind of counterpart, or a twin counterpart who was the opposite in this kind of gender mix than I was, but a complement, so a complementary, but in the sense that both of them were very androgynous, kind of balanced gender, but a slightly complementary aspect to them, and that one was slightly more dominant in one than the other. That's what it felt like anyway. But and yeah, that we communicated through telepathy rather than through any language. So we communicated through telepathy with this other sort of counterpart, and we were in this barn, on this kind of like a barn in this massive field of kind of like long grass or barley or something like that, and so yeah, that was another dream I had, and the notion in the law of one is actually that these blue avian beings are our future selves, or our higher selves, talking back to us. So this was something that I used eventually to create my poetry tarot show, which I embodied this blue avian being, or I dress as this bird being, and give people poetry tarot readings by tuning into their frequency using light language, which is kind of like a language beyond language, a bit like gibberish, a bit like the language that they use in that the weather reporter suddenly is channeling this alien language. But some people call it light language in New Age communities, and you can sort of be initiated into it. But some people also say that gibberish was a way that the Baptists were trying to get speaking in tongues into the drama syllabus, and some people say actually that speaking in tongues is speaking to the Holy Spirit, or channeling the Holy Spirit. Some people see it as demonic. Light language is more of a New Age way of looking at it, and there's all these light language codes, and I actually had a dream once where I was lying in bed and I woke up and saw this kind of vortex of all these light language codes in this kind of spiral around my, coming out of my vision, my sort of vision, and it was quite bizarre. And it was about the time that I'd started learning this kind of light language. So yeah. I've also I mentioned in my last video that I was doing a meditation about Sirius B with this guy, Steve Nobel. It was a guided meditation, and I suddenly got transported to this lion planet where I was dancing around in electric blue fire. as a lion being with a group of lion beings in a circle, and that was I hadn't heard of the Lyrans at that stage, and looked up lion beings on the internet and found out all about Lyrans and Lyran starseeds and their personality traits, which really did resonate with me. I didn't necessarily hold it to be true, but this dream seemed to suggest that it felt like I was there at some point. I kind of take it all with a pinch of salt, but the notion that we could have lived lives on other planets. I had a reading at a festival, which was a galactic reading, which was talking about your starseed origins, and she said that I was Lyran, and I've even put it through AI, and it's come up with a similar notion too, that I have Lyran qualities, or that I have, my galactic origins are from Lyra and Sirius, which is exactly what came through the AI, which is fascinating because it correlates to everything that I dreamed. And I also have had visions once of being this dog, kind of like this luck dragon, a bit like Valcor in the Never-Ending Story, if you've seen that movie, flying through space. And I had another luck dragon with me as well that felt like a twin or a sibling or something like that, so that's another dream that I had. And there are a couple of times myself when I have seen UFOs. And one time was when I was in America and we were going out for a walk, some of us from the community that I was staying at, and we saw a golden, a sort of red, I think it was a red light moving uniformly across the horizon. Or was it uniformly? I wrote a poem about it actually. But it was not moving. Maybe it wasn't moving uniformly. It wasn't like it was definitely not a satellite or a plane, because it wasn't moving like a satellite or a plane. It was moving erratically, I think. And someone looked at it through their binoculars and saw this glimpse of a golden sphere, and then it suddenly disappeared over the horizon. And the second time I had an experience like that, I was down on a festival and we were all down there looking up at the stars, and both of us, there were two of us that looked up, and around one kind of star it seemed like there were all these other moving things that looked a bit like stars, but they were moving all around, and there were quite a few of them, like a whole lot of them. And it was incidentally after I'd got a meditation technique about ships, 17 ships, and there were a whole lot of these spaceships up there. Someone sort of dismissed them as satellites or Starlink, and it's possible that that's what it was. I don't really know. I'm not familiar with that, but it certainly seemed there was something up there moving round the stars, and there were a lot of them, and they were kind of darting around like this. It was quite interesting for a while. And the notion in the Ascension myths is that these 17 ships came from Maldek, or in the book it's called Martanda, to Earth and brought the wreckages brought from the wreckage of Martunda. They kind of brought the seeds of civilization, like plants and animals, a bit like an ark, to Earth, so that civilization could start anew on Earth. And that, I think, was meant to be Lemuria, or in the book it might be called Emura. But also I've been tuning into this thing recently on AI about Hyperborea, which was an earlier, it sort of suggested that there were these beings that came out of the sun, light beings that came and established a colony in the north of planet Earth when it was not ice. It was a fertile Greenland, and that this civilization was called Hyperborea, and that was the first civilization here, but it was a highly enlightened civilization, and that was the Golden Age, whereas Lemuria was the Silver Age, and that was they were still apparently light beings, or some even think of the Lemurians as being blue beings, and the notion that the Pleiadians had interactions with Lemuria, and then the notion that there's a civilization called Atlantis, that there was a bit of a crossover, that Atlantis was in the northern hemisphere, but the notion is that Atlantis was actually many civilizations, that there were many versions of Atlantis over 200,000 years, and that the island that we think of Atlantis is actually an island called Poseidonus, that is just a small story of the history of Atlantis, and that Atlantis was sort of the Bronze Age, and that it kind of started off as being quite highly evolved, but then it kind of, over the time, it sort of deteriorated, where these archons supposedly came in and interfered, and people were creating chimeras or using crystal technology for dark purposes or things like that, and humanity devolved or something like that. Not really entirely sure about the whole of that story, but I have got this on AI, and I intend to do a bit of a talk about it, a summary of it, because it's really interesting and it's got more knowledge on that, so that will be in another video. But anyway, that is just my thoughts on Disclosure Day. The main points being that I found that when they finally did get to these videos being released, I found that moment quite moving, almost like it was a collective sigh of relief, or a collective lifting of the veil, or a collective awakening that occurred as a result of this, and that actually these beings are trying to... That the notion is that these beings have been around. Our planet is quite young, and that we are in fact in kindergarten as far as the universe is concerned, and that there are civilizations way more evolved than us, and that if they become more evolved in technology without the consciousness there, then they'd probably destroy themselves like we did. But the notion that they are higher evolved in consciousness than us, and are therefore watching this planet, especially when we start forming nukes. I think with the notion that our evolution was interfered with, and suddenly we went from, and we were given technologies by extraterrestrial races, and suddenly we leapt from people running around with swords to nuclear bombs in a very short amount of time. And that when nuclear bombs explode, they don't just affect our planet, they affect the whole solar system or cosmos. So because there's interdimensional realms to Earth as well, so there's interdimensional beings, and there's beings inside the Earth that potentially would also be affected by big bombs being, and it might also knock the Earth off its axis or something like that. So the notion that we went from relatively primitive technology to advanced technology very quickly, and that there's been a lot of, for example, alien spaceships sighted around nuclear bombs, and the notion, of course, the military and the government sort of suggest that these are that we have to be scared of them, and because it's concerning that these beings are around our nuclear facilities, and there's even notions that they have triggered nuclear weapons both in Russia and in the States, and turned them on, the launch on, and then they switch them off again. But the notion is actually that these beings are actually trying to stop us from having nuclear war, that they interfere with nuclear launches and destroy these nuclear missiles, and have, on occasions when these nuclear bombs could have gone off, like with Kim Jong-un or whatever, doing nuclear testing, so that these ships actually come and disarm the nuclear missiles before they can go off, which is because after Hiroshima they suddenly woke up to the fact that we were experimenting with these, so they've been keeping an eye on us. And also that brings in the notion that this planet is evolving to a point beyond war, hopefully, and that the reason extraterrestrials haven't shown themselves to us yet is because we're too primitive in that sense, and that we haven't evolved beyond war yet. And so collectively, when we evolve beyond war, that's when extraterrestrials will actually show us and welcome us into the galactic family. And this is a notion that the notion of the moon landing is that when we landed on the moon, we were told that we weren't allowed to be there because we are too low in consciousness to be part of that galactic family at this point in time. So the notion being that in this time, as disclosure arrives, we are going to evolve beyond war and into being part of a galactic family. And this is something that Bashar talks about, where he says that there's hybrid beings, and that we will be introduced to hybrid beings, and eventually, or alien races, we will be eventually introduced to alien races, and the notion of hybrid beings, which are beings that have been sort of hybridized with humans, and that some of the souls incarnating on the planet at the moment are actually hybrids, or have advanced souls, and so they've incarnated from other star systems, and they find it difficult to be here because they're of a higher consciousness than most of humanity. But the reason is that these hybrids start incarnating here more and more to raise the consciousness of humanity. As a collective, by having more of these hybrids here, it raises the consciousness of humanity by having higher conscious beings, more higher conscious beings as part of our population. So, yeah, that is a wide discussion about. It's really also just scratching the surface, and I'm sorry that it was so higgledy-piggledy and kind of clutching at a whole lot of different ideas. But I guess that's the notion that I wanted to present, is that there's also the notion within religion and spirituality where some people, if you look at comments on Facebook, see these extraterrestrials as being demons, and that humanity is the only race that is made in the likeness and image of God, and that these other races are actually demonic, and that this is part of Revelation or something like this. But that's quite a dark view. There's also in ancient Vedic texts, they talk about spaceships called Vimanas, and there's pictures of them, and there's pictures of spaceships in Peru and stuff in their rock carvings and things like that, and in the Aborigines talk about the Pleiadians, and every myth actually around the planet, every myth in indigenous culture. The Greeks talk about the Pleiades, the Maori talk about Matariki, which is the Pleiades, and Hei-Tiki, who came from the stars. The Aborigines talk about the star beings. So yeah, there's a lot, and so do the American Native Americans talk about the Hopi, and the other Native American tribes talk about these star beings. There's also a notion that every insect on planet Earth has every insect and every animal on planet Earth has a mirror alien race somewhere, and that's why we have that array of life on Earth, and that's actually everywhere in the universe. Also, the notion that a lot of extraterrestrial races are actually human in form. The Pleiadians, for example, bipedal, that most of the races out there are actually bipedal, although they might be a mix with animal, like the lions, who are two-footed lion beings, or the mantises, which stand on 2 feet but then look like praying mantises, or the lizard reptilians, or the greys, or the dogons, I believe they're called, the dog race, or the blue avians, who are also 2 feet beings, so bipedal. But anyway, so that's just a tiny fraction of the lore out there that is there regarding extraterrestrial races. So that's why I thought Disclosure Day was a very small snapshot of that, and what we're getting through the UFO files is also just a small snapshot of that. But there is a lot of information out there if you look at it, if you look in the right place. I've certainly been on this path for a while, not necessarily intentionally, but it kind of presented itself to me, if you like. So if you want to hear more, I will be talking about this kind of stuff a bit more, and other kind of stuff, not related to this, but partly related, because the microcosm is in the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is in the microcosm. There's everything is connected, and this is why I think this is so important, is because it's a huge part of our story that has been suppressed because they didn't believe that we were ready for it. But part of the age of disclosure is, I think, that some of these races that have been interacting with us have made deadlines for the planet where this had to happen. So potentially this information had to be released by this time. They gave us a deadline to do this by, and so we have to the governments have had an agreement with them that they had to disclose at this time, and hence movies like Disclosure Day were in the making, because and this they had to have we had to have disclosure at some point. It was in some contract, or some I don't know how to explain that, but either a contract with these ET races, or some kind of universal timing that to do with the planet and how it's moving through the solar system. Because we're moving into a different part of the solar system, and that's part of these 26,000 year cycles also that are talked about, these ages, and also these ages of Aquarius in astrology and things like this. We're moving into the age of Aquarius. The Mayan calendar has these 26,000 year cycles, and so the notion is that as a planet, 2012 was meant to be the middle of what is called the precession of the equinox, or the wobble, where we're going through a huge amount of change as a planet and moving beyond into a new age, kind of a new age of peace. And so we're going through all this upheaval between, and it's a 36-year window up till 2030, where the whole planet is going through a huge amount of upheaval and transition, and all the systems of the world that have been out of integrity are suddenly crumbling and being remade and rebuilt in integrity, to move back into this higher consciousness age where we'll start living longer. We go in the Vedic tradition, they're talked about as yugas. So you go from the Sat Yuga, which is the golden age, and then the the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and then you go into the Copper Age, I think it is maybe, which is the Kali Yuga, which is the lowest age, and then it goes from the Kali Yuga, and in any of these ages, like in the Golden Age, there's a lot more conscious beings, but in the Kali Yuga, still there is a range of beings from low vibration to high vibration, but then and so there are high vibrational beings on the planet during the Kali Yuga, but then it goes back into the Sat Yuga again, and that's the notion, is that we're moving back into the Golden Age again. And that's when people live a lot longer, like thousands of years potentially. So the notion that we can live a lot longer than we are is exciting. How long that will take, I believe the transition will take quite a bit of time before we get to that stage. But maybe even 150 years might be a long shot, or 200. Maybe in a couple of 100 years, maybe in 100 years we'll be living to those ages. We don't know, but it's exciting times, put it that way. And yeah, that the notion that these ages are actually connected to where our because the sun is moving through the solar system with all the planets around it. We're not, the sun isn't stationary. Our solar system moves through the galaxy. So I believe that and there's all these notions of solar flares and things like that. So when it moves through particular parts of the galaxy, then the planet is affected in different ways, and so maybe we're moving closer to the central sun or something like this, where there's more light on the planet, and so that means there's higher consciousness. It's a higher consciousness state to be in. And if you look at evolution over the last 50 years, it seems that we are hopefully evolving beyond war. It has looked in the recent past that we might enter into World War III and go but the notion is that we're going through this kind of death rattle of the old energy that's trying to sort of take us with it, but the idea is that we transcend this and move through it. And thankfully we haven't had World War III. We've had some horrible atrocities happen, but we haven't had World War III. And the notion being that most people on the planet, I don't think, want to go to war or are interested in war. And so it's not in the consciousness of the planet for World War III to happen, because we've evolved beyond that. And we're going to keep on evolving beyond that to a point where we become part of the galactic family again. Anyway, thanks for listening. I know it went everywhere and anywhere, but it's such a big topic, and there's so much to it that I wanted to, open the conversation beyond just greys or a very limited version, or just aliens or ETs, or that they're all the same, that there's humanity and there's only one type of alien. What if there are 69 different types, or a lot more than that? It's what we're seeing is just a very microscopic flash in the pan of what's really out there. So what I'm really trying to do is just expand the conversation beyond the minimum. If you liked, please subscribe and join below and comment below.